What if I told you that during the Cold War, the United States built a weapon so terrifying, so absolutely devastating, that even the generals who commissioned it became afraid of what they'd created? I'm not talking about the atomic bomb. I'm not talking about hydrogen bombs or ICBMs. I'm talking about a flying nuclear reactor that would spew radiation across entire continents, travel at near supersonic speeds just above the ground, and remain airborne for months, destroying everything in its path before finally crashing into its target. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is Project Pluto. And for decades, it was one of America's most closely guarded secrets. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the Cold War arms race. The year is 1957. America is losing the space race. The Soviets just launched Sputnik. Nuclear anxiety is at an all-time high. School children are doing duck and cover drills. Families are building fallout shelters in their backyards. And deep inside the Pentagon, military strategists are asking themselves a terrifying question. How do we ensure that if war breaks out, we can deliver nuclear weapons to Soviet targets, no matter what? See, conventional missiles had a problem. They followed predictable trajectories, they could be tracked, they could potentially be intercepted, and once launched, they couldn't be recalled or redirected. So the best minds in American military science came up with something that sounds like it came straight out of a horror movie. They called it SLAM, Supersonic Low Altitude Missile. Here's how it would work, and I need you to really understand the insanity of this design. This missile would be powered by a nuclear ramjet engine, not a conventional engine, not even a rocket, a nuclear reactor that would heat incoming air to create thrust. The thing would fly at Mach 3, that's 3 times the speed of sound, at an altitude of just 500 to 1,000 feet above the ground. Let that sink in. A nuclear reactor screaming across the landscape at over 2,000 miles per hour, close enough to the ground that you could see it coming. But here's where it gets truly apocalyptic. The engine wasn't shielded. It couldn't be shielded because shielding would make it too heavy to fly. So as this thing flew overhead, the nuclear reactor would be spewing lethal radiation across everything below it. Every town, every forest, every farm. Every person unfortunate enough to be in its path would be exposed to deadly gamma rays and neutron radiation. The missile itself would carry up to 16 hydrogen bombs. It would fly a pre-programmed route over the Soviet Union, dropping nuclear weapons on city after city. And here's the most terrifying part. It could stay airborne for months. The nuclear reactor gave it essentially unlimited range. It could circle the globe, waiting for orders, changing targets, flying patterns designed to maximize destruction. And when it finally ran out of targets, when its mission was complete, it would crash into one final city, detonating its reactor and spreading radioactive debris across the impact zone. This wasn't just a weapon. This was a flying apocalypse machine. If you're thinking this sounds too insane to be real, I need you to keep watching. Because not only was this real, but the United States actually built and tested the engine. And what they discovered was even more terrifying than they imagined. The project was handed to 2 organizations. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory would design the nuclear reactor, and a company called Marquardt would build the ramjet engine. The goal? Create a working nuclear ramjet engine within 5 years. Now, I need you to understand the engineering challenges here, because what these scientists were trying to do had never been attempted before. A ramjet engine works by compressing incoming air, heating it, and expelling it out the back. Simple in theory, but now imagine heating that air with a nuclear reactor that's traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. The reactor would have to operate at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The materials would have to withstand not just the heat, but the vibration, the air pressure, and the constant bombardment of neutrons from the nuclear reaction. They called the reactor Tori. Tori 2A was the first version, a massive contraption that weighed over a ton and produced 154 megawatts of power. In May 1961, they fired it up for the first time in the Nevada desert. For a few precious seconds, the scientists watched as their creation roared to life. A nuclear reactor, generating the thrust equivalent of a jet engine, just sitting there on a test stand. It worked. The test was successful enough that they immediately began work on Tori IAC, a more powerful version that would actually be flight capable. By 1964, they were ready for the big test. Tori IIC was mounted on a test stand at the Nuclear Rocket Development Station in Nevada. On a May morning, the reactor was brought to full power. For 5 full minutes, it screamed. The noise was deafening. The heat was incredible. and the radiation meters went off the scale. But it worked perfectly. The reactor produced 513 megawatts of power. It generated thrust equivalent to 35,000. It maintained stable operation at temperatures that would melt most conventional materials. The scientists had done it. They'd built a working nuclear ramjet engine. The Pentagon was ecstatic. Project Pluto was ahead of schedule. Within a few years, they'd have a working prototype missile. But then something changed. The very success of Project Pluto is what led to its cancellation, and the reason why tells you everything you need to know about just how dangerous this weapon truly was. Stay with me. This is where it gets really dark. As the scientists at Livermore continued their work, as the test data came in, as the simulations were run, a horrifying reality began to set in. This weapon was too effective. Think about what launching a SLAM missile would actually mean. First, you'd need to get it airborne. That meant strapping it to a massive rocket booster because the ramjet couldn't start from a standstill. So you'd launch this thing on a pillar of flame, probably from somewhere in Alaska or a naval vessel. Once airborne and up to speed, the nuclear reactor would kick in. Now this thing is flying at Mach 3, hugging the terrain at 500 feet. The sonic boom alone would shatter windows and eardrums for miles on either side of its flight path. But that's nothing compared to the radiation. As it screamed over the landscape, the unshielded reactor would be emitting gamma rays and neutrons that would deliver a lethal dose to anyone within a quarter mile of its flight path. Every town it flew over would be instantly condemned. Every person exposed would face radiation sickness and likely death. And remember, this thing could fly for months. The original mission profile called for it to fly a pattern over the Soviet Union that would cover over 100,000 miles before completing its mission. 100,000 miles of irradiated landscape, dozens of nuclear weapons dropped on cities, and then the final crash, spreading reactor debris across the last target. But here's what really scared the Pentagon. They ran the simulations, they did the math, and they realized that if the Soviets built something similar, and they absolutely would, there would be no defense. None. You can't shoot down something traveling in Mach 3 at treetop level with 1960s technology. The radar cross-section was minimal, the flight path was unpredictable, and it could change course at any moment. If both sides deployed these weapons, it wouldn't just be mutually assured destruction. It would be mutually assured extinction. The fallout from just a few of these missiles crisscrossing the atmosphere would contaminate the entire northern hemisphere. And there was another problem. How do you test this thing? You can't exactly fly a radiation-spewing nuclear missile over the United States to see if it works. And if you test it over the ocean or in the desert, you're still spreading massive amounts of radioactive contamination. The scientists at Livermore started running more detailed models of what would happen if a SLAM missile malfunctioned during flight. The results were catastrophic. If the reactor failed and the missile crashed over friendly territory, you'd have a nuclear disaster that would make Chernobyl look minor. If it crashed in the ocean, you'd contaminate vast stretches of international waters. And if it was ever deployed in anger, well, you'd better hope you win the war, because the environmental damage would last for generations. By 1963, cracks were forming in the project's support. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson, started asking hard questions. Why do we need a nuclear-powered cruise missile when we have ICBMs? Why do we need a weapon that contaminates its entire flight path when we have bombers and submarines? And most importantly, what happens when the Soviets build one? The more the Pentagon looked at Project Pluto, the more it looked like humanity handing itself a loaded gun and pointing it at its own head. In 1964, the same year as the successful Tory IIC test, funding for the project began to dry up. The official reason? ICBMs had become reliable enough that a nuclear-powered cruise missile was unnecessary. But people close to the project tell a different story. They say that when military leaders really sat down and thought through the implications of deploying SLAM, when they imagined a world where both superpowers had fleets of unkillable, radiation-spewing cruise missiles circling the globe, they blinked. For once in the Cold War arms race, sanity prevailed. In July 1964, Project Pluto was officially canceled. The Tory reactors were disassembled, the test facilities were shut down, the research was classified and buried. No SLAM missile was ever built. No nuclear ramjet engine ever flew. The scientists who worked on the project were reassigned. Some went to work on nuclear rockets for space exploration, a much more peaceful application of the technology. And for decades, Project Pluto remained classified. When documents finally started being declassified in the 90s and early 2000s, most people couldn't believe what they were reading. The United States had actually spent 8 years and over $260 million in 1960s money. That's over $2 billion today, developing a weapon that was essentially a flying Chernobyl with nuclear bombs attached. They'd actually built and tested the engines. They'd actually planned deployment strategies. They'd actually run simulations on how many Soviet cities could be destroyed in a single mission. And then, at the last moment, they'd realize what they were about to unleash. But here's the question that should keep you up at night. What other weapons were developed in secret that we don't know about? What other doomsday devices are sitting in classified files too dangerous to ever reveal? Let me leave you with some final thoughts. Project Pluto represents something unique in military history. It's one of the few times where weapons designers created something so terrible that it actually scared them into stopping. Think about that. These were people who'd built atomic bombs, who'd designed hydrogen bombs, who'd created delivery systems for weapons that could kill millions. But Project Pluto crossed a line even they couldn't accept. The technology developed for Pluto wasn't entirely wasted. The research into high-temperature materials and compact nuclear reactors contributed to space exploration programs. Some of the engineering solutions found their way into other defense projects. But the core concept, a nuclear-powered cruise missile, remains taboo to this day. No nation has ever deployed such a weapon. Well, probably. In 2018, Russia announced the development of the 9M730 Burevestnik. NATO calls it SSC X-9 Skyfall. According to Russian claims, it's a nuclear-powered cruise missile with unlimited range. Sound familiar? In 2019, a mysterious explosion at a Russian naval testing facility killed 5 scientists and released radiation into the surrounding area. Many experts believe it was a test of the Burevestnik. If true, it means that 60 years after Project Pluto was canceled, someone decided to resurrect the concept. Whether it will work, whether it will ever be deployed, whether it represents the same existential threat that SLAM did, we don't know. But the fact that the idea keeps coming back should tell you something. As long as nations compete for military supremacy, there will always be scientists and generals willing to push the boundaries of acceptable weapons. There will always be projects that ask, can we build this? Before asking, should we build this? Project Pluto asked both questions. They proved they could build it, and then, mercifully, they decided they shouldn't. But the blueprints still exist. The research is still in those declassified files. The knowledge of how to build a nuclear ramjet engine hasn't disappeared. It's just sitting there, waiting for the next crisis, the next arms race, the next moment when someone thinks the only way to ensure security is to build a weapon so terrible that even using it would be apocalyptic. Project Pluto was shelved. If this story terrified you, good, it should. These aren't ancient history. These technologies, these concepts, these weapons, they're still relevant today, and the only way to prevent them from being used is to remember what happened when we almost deployed them. If you found this video eye-opening, hit that like button. Share it with someone who thinks they know Cold War history. I guarantee this is a story they haven't heard. Subscribe to the channel because I've got more classified projects, more secret weapons, and more buried history that deserves to be told. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think weapons like Project Pluto will ever be deployed? Or did humanity actually learn something from this close call? Thanks for watching. And remember, the most dangerous weapons are often the ones we never hear about. Until next time, but the Pluto concept, the idea of unlimited range, unstoppable weapons delivery systems, never really went away. It just evolved. Hypersonic glide vehicles, nuclear-powered torpedoes, autonomous drone swarms. Each generation finds new ways to package the same old promise. Ultimate weapon, total victory, complete security. And each generation has to decide, is this the line we don't cross? Project Pluto was America's line. For once, we stepped back from the edge. But the edge is still there, and it's not going anywhere. If this story terrified you, good, it should. These aren't ancient history. These technologies, these concepts, these weapons, they're still relevant today. And the only way to prevent them from being used is to remember what happened when we almost deployed them. If you found this video eye-opening, hit that like button. Share it with someone who thinks they know Cold War history. I guarantee this is a story they haven't heard. Subscribe to the channel because I've got more classified projects, more secret weapons, and more buried history that deserves to be told. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think weapons like Project Pluto will ever be deployed? Or did humanity actually learn something from this close call? Thanks for watching. And remember, the most dangerous weapons are often the ones we never hear about. Until next time.